Welcome to Bible as Second Language, Session 7. When you come face to face with death, your whole life flashes before you. I haven't experienced that personally, but I've heard people say it really, truly happens. Something like that might have happened to God's chosen people in 586 BC. They had plummeted to the deepest, darkest point of their existence. Now they re-examined their past and they pondered what had gone wrong. As we learned in our last session, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar and his army had laid siege to Jerusalem. The people inside the city walls starved. The king tried to escape but was captured. His sons were slaughtered before his eyes. In 586 BC, Jerusalem fell. The temple was desecrated, stripped of its valuables, and burned to the ground. All of the social, religious, and political leaders were either executed or carried off into exile. You can read this sad ending in Jeremiah 52 and in 2 Kings 24. How could it be that God's chosen people could suffer so terribly? If this was punishment, why were the pagan nations not punished? How could this terrible loss happen if God was in charge of history? If this was simply an accident of history, then did God care at all what happened to them? I've heard people ask such questions, and I'm sure many of you have too. The book of Job, which may have been written about the time of the exile, wrestles with exactly these issues. If you look at the book, you will notice that chapters 1 and 2 and chapters 42, 7, verse 7 following are written in prose and tell the story of a wager between God and Satan on whether or not Job would remain faithful under fire. The other 39 chapters are in poetic form and are full of theological and philosophical arguments between Job and his friends on the question of suffering. According to Jeremiah, the exiles numbered no more than 4,600 people. This handful of survivors in Babylon looked back and tried to put together the pieces of their history. They remembered the beautiful beginning in the Garden of Eden, then the fall into disobedience, and the resultant descent into chaos. But God had not abandoned his earthly project. After one attempt with a global flood, God had decided to choose a family, mold that family into a holy people, and through them bring blessing and restoration to the entire world. They remembered the years of slavery in Egypt, God's rescue of them under the leadership of Moses, and their entrance into the Promised Land. They remembered the greatest time of their history under the leadership of David, and then shuddered as they thought of their long, steep plunge into civil war, then invasion by enemies, and now this reality, a pitiful handful of exiles, refugees living in a foreign land, surrounded by powerful pagans and their pagan gods. Take a look at Psalm 137. You can hear the bitterness and the pain of these people. Some of the other sad songs or laments that appear in the book of Psalms also were written at this time. Had God's plan come to an end? Was God's strategy buried in the rubble of the temple in Jerusalem? Without a land, without a nation, without a government, without a temple, how could there be a holy people? The exiles in Babylon wrestled with these questions. They were hanging on to their faith by fingertips, and their fingertips were quickly weakening. In these dreary, desperate days of the exile, Israel's faith was reborn. One of God's instruments in this rebirth were the prophets, those bold spokesmen for God. For centuries, the prophets had denounced the people's rebellion and announced the coming wrath of God. Now, as the people sat in the miserable ashes of their self-induced destruction, God's prophets announced words of hope. One of the strangest of all the prophets was Ezekiel. Probably he'd been captured and carried into exile during a first Babylonian attack on Jerusalem in 605 BC. The first 24 chapters of his book are full of strange visions and strange symbolic actions meant to convince the people that God was definitely going to punish them for all of their sin. But once Jerusalem falls in 586 BC, Ezekiel's message changes from one of gloom and doom to one of hope. Ezekiel now says, yes, you have been punished, but you have not been abandoned. Did you ever hear that old spiritual, them bones, them dry bones? Well, read Ezekiel 37, and you will see that the story of those dry bones is a message of hope to a people whose hope had nearly dried up. More powerful words of hope are found in the latter chapters of the book of Isaiah. The first 39 chapters of this great book come from Isaiah and were written from about 740 to 700 BC and call on the people to repent of their evil ways. But chapters 40 through 66 seem to come from another hand and speak to a very different situation. These chapters are full of words of comfort to people who are in desperate straits. Listen to the opening words of chapter 40. Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. During this time of exile, God's spokesman announced hope for the future. Yes, the people had been punished. Yes, the great nation had been destroyed, but all was not lost because God had not given up on them. One of the